Hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Well, welcome to the second day of our Art and Archives event series, which we've called Creative Encounters. This is jointly hosted by Art360 Foundation and the National Archives. What we'd like you to do is to use the chat option, which you should see along the bottom of the screen, to introduce yourself to other participants. Just say a bit perhaps about where you're from. And when you use the chat option, if you can make sure that you select the option that says all panelists and attendees, and that makes sure that everybody can read what you have to say. So in there, you can share your thoughts on our speakers' presentations. And if you have a question that you want us to ask the speakers, could you put it into the Q&A rather than the chat? Again, the Q&A is along the bottom of your screen. So do please keep some questions coming for us, and we'll be using those after the presentations. So just a little bit of housekeeping. There are going to be 2 Q&A sessions today. So I'll repeat myself now. Please do put your questions into the Q&A box as the presentations are going on. We're really looking forward to hearing from our speakers today. We're all very excited to know how they got on with their projects. Just a little warning that some of the presentations might include references and or images to sensitive subjects such as physical violence and traumatic historical events. So just please be aware of that. Okay, I'm going to do a 10-minute presentation now before we get started with our main speakers. So if you bear with me, I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you can all see that. So my name is Sarah Castagnetti, and I work at the National Archives, which is in Kew in West London. And I work in a department called Collections, Expertise and Engagement. And we run a public advice service, so people can email us, or they can go onto our online chat service, or they can come in person to visit us. And we give them advice to try and point them in the right direction so that they can carry out research. We don't actually get involved in doing research for people, but we do try and support them as they try to do their own research. But as individuals working at the National Archives, we do also carry out research into our collections. And then we use the knowledge that we gain and our expertise in the archives to engage with audiences in different ways. So maybe to support our events and exhibitions teams, and to provide content for social media, and to write blogs, to engage with academic audiences, and all that kind of thing. And I don't come from an academic background, but I have worked at the National Archives for a long time. And my current role, which I'm enjoying very much, and I've been doing for a few years, is managing a small team, and we focus on what we call the visual collections, which are photographs, artworks, designs, film, architecture records, and that's why we're involved in this event. So I just want to talk a little bit about archives, what they are, how maybe they're different to a library, and how the National Archives differs from other archives, and also just a very brief background about how the National Archives came to be. And then I'll also talk about how we came to have this event. So libraries are usually arranged in a way that's convenient for the library user, and not through just bloody-mindedness. Unfortunately, an archive is not arranged for the convenience of a user. But what happens in an archive, and if I take ours as an example, we take records from central government departments. So our records are arranged according to those departments, so the people that created the records, rather than by the subjects that those records might address. So the sort of people, the sort of departments or creators that we have the records from include major courts of law, central government departments, which obviously have changed over time, but modern day and historically, you have places like the Treasury and the Home Office, departments, modern day departments like digital, culture, media and sport and so on, the military, regulators of trade and commerce, the Board of Trade. We would get those records here. And also just a very small number of deposits of private documents where they really complement our collections. We would also have those. But the key thing is that we don't then take the content of those documents and put them into any other kind of order. They just remain as they were when they came to us. So the National Archives itself is a relatively recent name of our organisation. We were the Public Record Office originally, and then between 2003 and 2006 we joined with a number of other organisations, and then we became the National Archives. So the Public Record Office is the part of us that deals with government records, but we also include in our organisation Her Majesty's Stationery Office and the Royal Commission on Historical Manuscripts and the Office of Public Sector Information. And as I said, we are the archives of central government, as distinct from local government and also as distinct from Parliament. There's a whole separate organisation for parliamentary archives. And as an organisation, we work with government departments on a 20-year process where they review and ultimately select which records will ultimately come to us. And then when they're with us, we have a responsibility to preserve those records and to make them accessible. And that's physical documents, but increasingly also digital, although as it says on the slide, digital, so apologies for that, but digital records of the nation. And we are the archive sector lead, so we lead and support archives across England and Wales. The National Archives, as I've said already, really, we have central government records and some very few private deposits of records. And local government archives, they will have, for example, the records of local businesses or notable local families or individuals. So the connection between the two is that we will sometimes, we tend to have sort of the top level advice and policy giving documents, and then at a local level, they'll have the lower end of that. So for example, we would have Department of Education, policies on inspections, and then correspondence down to the local level where they then carry out those policies. And in a local archive, they would have the records of schools day-to-day running, so maybe the staff lists and pupils and so on, whereas we have that higher level. Okay, just a little bit about our history. So our, originally records, the earliest record we have is, or one of the earliest is the Domesday book, which is, we now just call Domesday. And at that point, records were stored in places like the Tower of London, and then other storage areas, such as the image here of the chapter house at Westminster Abbey. And records were stored in around 60 different places, across, mostly in London, but across the UK. And they really were not in very good conditions. They often suffered from damp. And being eaten by rats and mice and so on. So the system of storing records was not really functioning very well. So what happened in the early 19th century was that a gentleman called Henry Cole decided something needed to be done about the condition of government records. And this image of a mummified rat was used in evidence that Henry Cole gave to show how poor the conditions were and the damage that was being done to the documents, because in fact this rat ate some of the documents, and apparently in his stomach are some chewed up documents. I'm not quite sure how they worked that out. I don't really want to know. Okay, so by the 19th century, government was producing a large amount of documentation, mostly correspondence. We had some very bureaucratic departments by that time, some of which are listed on here, very big. So Admiralty and War Office, the Treasury, Foreign Office, Home Office and Board of Trade, all carrying out or producing large amounts of correspondence, and all of those had to be kept and they had to be able to track them. So they had their own registry systems where they would record what was coming in, where it went, how it was responded to, and then connect those things up with their own particular sort of registry coding. So now we find that in our collections, you need to kind of get familiar with how those registry systems work, because that now is also how you get to find correspondence. You have to kind of put yourself in the mindset of the clerks who were recording that correspondence and follow the same processes to find the items that you want. And as well as physical paper and parchment documents, we also archive government websites. And this is an example of a Treasury website from 1996. And they're all available on what's called the Government Web Archive, which you can reach through our website. That's 25 years ago, but yeah, strangely familiar. So just some of the documents that we have at the National Archives, just to give you a little flavour. Excuse me while I turn to my notes so that I can give you some quality information about each of these. So top left, you've got a picture of suffragettes Anne Kenny and Emmeline Pankhurst. We've got lots of documents relating to suffrage marches, protests and disturbances and so on. And then top middle, we've got the Doomsday Book. Over on the top at the right there, the Declaration of Independence for the United States of America, and that is one of 26 surviving copies of what's known as a Dunlap print. And out of those 26 surviving copies, we have 4 in the National Archives. At the bottom right, that's an example of a military-made map. That's a map drawn by a naval cartographer called Matthew Flinders, who was the first person to circumnavigate Australia, and that's a map from 1804. And then in the bottom, in the middle, an example of a propaganda poster created by the Ministry of Information in the Second World War. And bottom left, 2 signatures of Guy Fawkes showing the effect of the torture that he suffered. The shaky Guido signature at the bottom was immediately after torture, and at the top, the slightly more steady Guido Fawkes was written 8 days later. So a quick run through of how we organised this event. We had an open call for artists, and we asked them to talk about how they would engage with material from the National Archives, and we wanted to try and find out how understanding our collections could inform artist practice at the point of conceiving artworks and ideas, as it says on the slide there. What we wanted to do was to understand how engagement with archives could fit into different artists' practices, needs of the artist. So after the open call, we sifted the applications and were delighted to be able to pick the 4 artists that you're going to hear from today. We had some initial online discussions with them, talking about what I've just told you, really, sort of the background to the archives and how they could use them. We had some follow-up discussions. We found out how their work was going and answered any further questions. And now they're ready to give you their workshop presentations. So I think I'm 1 minute over time. Sorry, I had to rush things a little bit at the end there. I get carried away talking about the archives. So we're ready now, I think, to hand you over to our first artist. So this is Rashi, and if you bear with me, I'll tell you a little bit about Rashi. So Rashi is a London-based artist working predominantly with image, sound and text, and her influences stem from continuous research into the understanding of objects and how they are defined, and how this behaviour further extends to the human narration of situations and events. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Sarah.
There we go.
Right, hello everyone. I'll just start then, yeah? Right. So I'm just going to jump right in. For the last 2 years, I have been making an inquiry into the first ever image of a black hole, which was presented to the world back in April 2019. You might remember it because of its very global presentation through media, and then also its equally wide dissemination through social media in the form of memes. One strand of this very wide project is also focusing on the origins of the term black hole and asking, where does that terminology come from? And it actually is connected to the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta. So some of you may have heard of the Black Hole of Calcutta before, but just to summarize, in the 1700s, there were lots of European traders that came over to India to buy resources and then sell them back to Europe. Over time, they then started to settle along India's coastlines and would create defensive headquarters to protect their trade. The British faction was called the East India Trading Company, and their defensive headquarters was in Calcutta. And they had a building that was known as Fort William. In Fort William, there was a military prison cell known as the Black Hole by sailors and other traders at the time. In 1756, the local Indian prince, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, decided to fairly take back Calcutta from the British, and he very much succeeded. After the fight, any British captives were gathered up, put into that black hole prison cell, and then left there overnight. And as the story goes, out of 146 people, only 23 survived that night due to suffocation and heat exhaustion. So that story very quickly made its way back to Britain soon after. The highest ranking survivor of that event, a man called John Holwell, wrote a long account, I think it was almost 50 pages, which then ended up being printed as a book and then disseminated very widely at the time. Now, many do dismiss the book for its hyperbolic and dramatic tone. The published version even asks the reader to forgive the author for being at times somewhat passionate and at times somewhat diffused. But the Black Hole of Calcutta story was used as a catalyst by the British government to then go out and physically take over India through the East India Trading Company, starting with a fight known as the Battle of Plassey, which happened the following year after Calcutta was taken. That now highly contested narrative of the Black Hole of Calcutta is thought to have helped create a notion of national trauma to then aid the justification of Britain's colonization of India. So the story was really woven into 19th century literature and culture. You can see it in Edward Bellamy's 1888 socialist utopian novel, Looking Backward, which was a third bestseller in the US at the time. Edward Allan Poe's The Premature Burial, Vanity Fair, many science and medical journals, and many other texts. Even a book that I found the other day, it's called the Encyclopedia of Dates and Events. And at 1756, there's an entry which notes when Calcutta was captured by Siraj-ud-Dowlah and references the Black Hole of Calcutta. So these are just a few examples of many that show how the story has been interlaced into British culture. To the point where in 1960, an astrophysicist called Robert Dicke started talking about the Black Hole of Calcutta story in his science lectures. He was comparing the black hole prison cell to this idea that Einstein had, that you can have an object in space that has such a strong gravitational pull that nothing can escape it. By using the Calcutta story in his lectures, he then ended up giving the name black hole to this theoretical object by Einstein. And this is why we use this term in science today. So I was really excited to engage with the National Archives and just to see if the Black Hole of Calcutta story can be found anywhere in their government records. If so, in what way? And if not, what does that mean? Or what could that mean? I was given a really great introductory session where I was given lots of handy tips, including the fact that the National Archives can only hold about 5% of all of the government documents that they receive, naturally mostly due to space. And then on top of that, I think it was only about 8 to 10 of that has been digitized. So because I was physically able to, I really wanted to go to the National Archives in Kew and actually physically handle the documents. So these images here are hopefully just a nice example of the physical quality of some of the documents that I engaged with. So when you want to work with the National Archives, you use an online catalogue to pre-book the things that you would like to see beforehand. It's called the Discovery Catalogue. So I tried to start off quite basic and straightforward, and I just put in the term black hole, connected it to some certain departments to then see what would come up. So the first thing that came up was this map of a building in Ghana known as the Cape Coast Castle. In some external research, the castle has been referred to as a slave castle. The map was made in 1756, or is a representation of the castle in 1756, which is really great because it's the exact same year as the Black Hole of Calcutta event. So the reason why this became part of my own research and came up in the results is if you look closely into the map, next to the guard room and the corporal's room, you have this tiny sliver of a tunnel, which is referred to as a black hole. This is a really valuable bit of research for me because it shows me some clear evidence that the term black hole was used for prison cells around that time, at the very least in English. Previously, all my online and remote research on that felt a bit flaky and anecdotal, so this was a really important outcome of this research. Just to show the connection, this is a map found in my own external research. This isn't from the National Archives, but it shows the Fort William defensive headquarters in Calcutta. It's in the red circle there. And then if we look at a closer map, towards the top, there's a room numbered 16. And when you look at the references, you'll see that that refers to a room called the Black Hole. Next, I found another form of black hole in England. Within the Peak District, there was, and technically still is, a lead mine referred to as the Black Hole Lead Mine. This document has a date as early as 1756, which is 12 years after the Black Hole of Calcutta event. So this document has created a really interesting question mark for me that I'm kind of taking even further past this opportunity, where I would like to know, why was it decided to be called Black Hole? Was it influenced by the Black Hole of Calcutta story, which arrived in the country 11 years beforehand? Or was it named before the event? And was there any kind of influence? Was that any influence on the fact that prison cells were referred to as black holes? If anyone has any information on that, actually, that would be really great. So that's a question that I'm hoping to answer in the future. Then we have David Clayton. I got a series of letters that kind of spat out from the Discovery Catalogue, and I wasn't really sure why. But I sat with them and I read through them. And it's this man who travels to India to work in service of the East India Trading Company, and he ends up being a captain. He talks about how he's excited to make lots of money and how apparently he has quite a boring wife back home. And he's finding it difficult to sleep in this hellish country. And I wasn't really sure where the letters were going. Although on top of that, it was quite an amazing experience to feel like you're sat in the same space as the person who originally wrote these letters, or to be engaging with this material in a similar way that he may have been. And then right at the end of the document, there was this other letter written by somebody else, and it feels as though it's his accountant. And he writes, let's see, I've got a close up here. He writes, "It said David Clayton being one of those unfortunate persons who perished by being confined in the black hole." So David Clayton was someone who allegedly died in the black hole prison cell that night. This again is really valuable research for me because there is a lot of contention in terms of both who died in the black hole prison cell and how many. Many historians agree that the number of 146 people that were initially put into the prison cell is an impossible amount purely based on physics. So historian Jan Daly, who talks about how when Calcutta was being attacked that night in 1756 by the Indian prince and his soldiers, that there was a really big flaw in the British defense strategy. I think it was the western gate of Fort William was left unprotected. So many Indian soldiers came in and were able to kill some of the British people. She and some others suggest that perhaps the inflated death count is a way of absorbing some of those more reckless deaths. And then finally, we have this monument. So again, the images on the screen right now are from my external research, but just to help give more context to the following slide, which will show an image by the National Archives. Since the time period I'm focused on is so far back, I didn't expect to engage with many or any images, but I did end up finding an image that is based on this memorial. This memorial is in Calcutta, and it was privately commissioned by John Holwell, the man who wrote the account that I spoke about before. Has quite a funny history in how it was initially erected, then supposedly went missing, re-erected by Lord Curzon in 1901, and then officially taken down as part of the Indian independence movement. And now it sits away from the main street in the garden of a church. So here is the image that I came across at the National Archives, and there's a few interesting things here. First, the fact that it's referred to as a photograph, when it kind of looks much more like it's an illustration or maybe some kind of reproduced photograph that's been coloured over, and it's actually part of a set of coloured postcards. On top of that, the rest of the images in this folder, which all have the exact same format as you see here, where there's a piece of paper with all of the information, and then the image is kind of stuck onto the top left corner. They all visually represent many different foreign countries. So you have China, now Myanmar, Japan, etc. And all of the images seem to be quite symbolic, or the images have ended up being symbolic, the people in traditional clothing, rice fields, etc. And they become, that's a quite a significant point, because these become symbols, particularly for people who may never learn any more about these places. And what was most interesting for me was that one of the only images for India, of all things, is an image of this memorial, a symbol of a perceived tragedy. I thought it would also be helpful to show some of the challenges that I had in this research too, and what I actually gained from those challenges. So when I was going into this, I assumed that I would be able to access loads of documents from the East India Trading Company. But unfortunately, the India Office records, which would contain most of these, was donated to the British Library instead. So the top left image on here is an example of how the Discovery Catalogue will show you things that are in other archives. So I would see lots of results in my search that were really exciting, but unfortunately held at the British Library. So that was a challenge, but I'm actually really glad, because it forced me to look at the periphery and to look at the footprints and to think more about how things can show themselves through indexicality rather than just overtness. And essentially, it just made me work much harder. And to the right and bottom, there were some things that I couldn't request through the online system. It's a group of images by Cecil Beaton that I initially wanted to see, but when it came to ordering it online through the system, it wouldn't allow me to. Again, I'm actually really grateful, because I think it would have taken me quite far away from the core research that I was doing. But I think it's quite helpful to give a more kind of fuller view of our experiences when we're engaging with archives. So when I look at what I found, I have 3 final takeaways. First, technically, I found almost no reference to the Black Hole of Calcutta in any official, formal national government records. The only times being that memorial image by Walter Meakin, and then the accountant of David Clayton, who makes that reference in that letter. That's it, nothing else. It could be really easy to then say that, oh, that's quite shifty, and particularly for a story that is so strongly woven into British culture to the point where people don't even realise. For that to not come up at all in the archive then just makes me think more about political relationships to stories and narrative, how maybe its historical ubiquity within British literature and vernacular is part of the reason why it doesn't need to be written into any government records. If you believe that it was used as a catalyst for colonization, then the story has a really particular purpose that maybe lends itself to specifically not being recorded in the government records. One might want it to just thrive through culture instead. But that does bring me to a second point. In the meeting last week, Sarah made a really good point that essentially what you're searching for in the catalogue, when you're searching for documents in the catalogue, what you put into the search is going to determine what you get out. So when I say that I found very little, that doesn't mean that nothing's there. Finding more may just require having a more expansive approach in terms of how I search, finding out more about the language of the time and what certain documents might be titled as. So I certainly don't feel like I can come to any major conclusions with my research yet. There's still a lot more to do. And finally, I've thought a lot about the experience of physically going to the archive and engaging with the materials. Handling the documents, and particularly the letters, as I said, was an amazing experience because it's just so different to looking online or remotely. There's an intimacy that you just can't get otherwise. I really valued this, and it's had a huge impact on my whole relationship to this project. But on top of that, I do think it's really important for us to think about what is outside of that document. I think there's the complexity there when you're physically handling the documents that makes you feel like what you're looking at is suddenly more accurate or more valid or is stronger evidence for your research when that might not be the case. These are really acute things, these documents that we collect to produce a history. Focusing on one piece so much and having that added layer of that physical relationship to it might alter your perception and the perspective of your project. So I think it's a really important thing to remember when we talk about that special feeling that you have when you physically engage with materials, to remember that there's context in everything. So yeah, it's been a really rich and thought-provoking experience. And I definitely feel like my time with the National Archives has only just started. So I just want to say thank you to the National Archives and Art360 for creating this opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Rishi. We always love to hear how much people have enjoyed engaging with the archives. So our next artist is Max Colson. Max is a British artist using animation, film and game design to explore how ideas related to architecture, landscape and British identity are constructed. He has had solo exhibitions at British galleries and institutions such as Vitrine and Arbeit and the Royal Institute of British Architects. His films have been screened in a variety of international film festivals in the UK and Europe, and his film Construction Lines was winner of the UK's Tenderflix Artist Video Prize in 2017. In 2019, he was selected to participate in Film London's Flaming Fellowship Programme for emerging artist filmmakers, and his films were logged in the BFI's National Archive. So over to you, Max.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So my name is Max Colson. In my artistic practice, what I mainly do is work with found content that I find online and in archives, and I'm interested in producing new images, new virtual worlds, and short films from this content. So this is an example of, well, this is still from a film that I made in 2017 called The Green and Pleasant Land, and in this film, I make a 3D model of the UK, using only images and texts that I find online, and this material is used during the course of the film to construct this 3D model, which you see being built as the film unravels itself, and this leads to a kind of this rather strange collected portrait of the UK and its history, which is kind of it's much more of a caricature than an accurate version, and that is a kind of a reflection of the kind of content that I end up working with. So this is an example of that film being exhibited. This is a more recent project that I made with Vitrine Gallery over the summer, and this is an interactive virtual world called The Island, and I basically draw upon a lot of content from the Imperial War Museum's digital collection, and also use content that I found online. And I've made a kind of I made an island which you can walk around, which is neither set. It's kind of in between 1940s Second World War era Britain and present day Britain. But you have to walk around the island and look at content and listen to what's going on the speaker systems that are kind of implanted at various points in the island to kind of come to a sense of this in between place that this British island is in, and this kind of relation, the kind of connections between contemporary Britain and Second World War Britain is something I'm really interested in, because of the way that Second World War history and mythology has been recirculated during recent times of national crisis. So yeah, this is it's basically an interactive archive that you can walk around. So my current research is interested in exploring what kind of collective memory of the Blitz, which is kind of early 1940s Britain, when Britain was being bombed by Nazi Germany, what kind of collective memory of the Blitz exists in modern British culture, and how this relates to historical accounts, documentation and propaganda produced during and after the Blitz period. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I use content that I found at the National Archive to start to make images and start to make the kind of the basis of a short film script, as a form of research. So what I looked at in the National Archives, I looked at three areas: government memoranda about propaganda and the representation of the Blitz, government photographs from the Blitz, and government propaganda material produced during the Second World War, to kind of bolster morale. So I did, when I went to the National Archives last Friday, I did what I normally do, which is I take loads of images. So I took about 600 images of all of the content that I looked at, because I want to play with it afterwards. So this is a really important part of my research process. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what I was looking at. I was looking at censorship of press photography, some general instructions for the press on how to photograph in Britain during the Second World War. I was kind of quite interested in the guidance given to the publication of information about damage caused by air raids, and came across this really interesting file on the use of psychology and propaganda. And then I also was looking at images, and I came across some amazing images produced by the government for the war efforts. I was also looking at propaganda, war art, and images. I was particularly interested in images that were kind of designed to, I guess, like kind of incentivize a kind of national effort in food production. And also these images, or these kind of examples of war art, that kind of reflect this kind of, I guess now you're looking at them, you kind of think about this nostalgia for Britain's like kind of former industries. So I'm gonna show you how I use some of this content to generate images. So this is a very recent project that I started working on over the last month. It's called Reconstructions, and basically in this project I take kind of images from British government propaganda from the Second World War, and I cut them up and I restaged them in 3D software, but I restaged them in 3D environments that I've constructed that visually relate to the imagery in the propaganda, but they also are slightly different. And I'm kind of interested in taking these images apart and restaging them to, I guess, think about or draw attention to the ideas that they're trying to construct visually. So I've been having a lot of fun kind of cutting up these images and restaging them in different scenes, and kind of yeah, playing around with kind of 3D models and kind of scenes, or using kind of 3D assets that I think kind of have a kind of more contemporary resonance, and just kind of creating like strange juxtapositions with this imagery. I've also been kind of using photographs from the Blitz, and cutting them up in the same way too. And I think these have like a slightly different dramatic effect when they're restaged. So this is an image from Liverpool during the Blitz, and the original image was a kind of photograph of people walking to work past loads of smouldering wreckage as if nothing has happened. I think that kind of the restaging of this image in this kind of, I guess, like a kind of more contemporary, well, in a more contemporary setting, kind of speaks to more of how the past is always with us in some way. Yeah, so I'm kind of interested in playing with these kind of I guess like the kind of dramatic effects of restaging this kind of historic kind of propaganda material. This is another image I've recently made, using the starting image was an image of people queuing up for a bakery, yeah, this restaging kind of speaks to more of I guess like queuing as a British national pastime, but also connects this past queuing to more recent queuing that happens during the pandemic. So this is a kind of one of the images that I took from the National Archives when I went. So this is the process that I kind of go through to kind of make these images. I kind of clean them up, and I start to kind of cut them up into small pieces, and I find that this process is quite a helpful way of getting me to look more kind of in a more focused way at small details and like the components of the image, and like kind of how these, you know, like kind of how these parts all kind of work together, but also like these individual actions all like kind of have connotations and suggest something about, I guess, like British character or attitudes, or a kind of maybe a kind of spirit. And so I cut these images up, and then I kind of place them on billboards in 3D software, and then I kind of take them into a 3D environment, and they just sit there. And but I'm kind of interested in designing the 3D environment so it kind of connects more to the images. So in these images, I was kind of looking for ways that I could do that. So I kind of thought, well, kind of start off with the trees, because there seem to be some trees in the background, so you can add some trees in, maybe like in the foreground there's this kind of man and this cart. I could probably find a 3D asset for that, and there's also a woman in, you know, just to the right, who's kind of holding a sack, so I could also find a 3D asset for that, and by adding those in, I kind of it creates a kind of interesting like visual trick, where I guess it's kind of not clear which has started which. The 3D environment was the 3D environment the start of the image, or was the photograph like the kind of the source material? So I'm kind of interested in like maybe kind of adding complicating the relationship between these two images. I I then kind of I guess like I then kind of start to think about, well, how can I add a kind of more contemporary like twist to the image, and make it relate to the present day. So I started to add in kind of these contemporary models, and I don't think it really works, but I think there is a really interesting image in here about food production, and maybe how food production and attitudes towards participating in food production have changed over the years since 1940. This image still needs a bit of work. But I also work a lot with verbatim text, and I use that to kind of generate scripts for short films that I make using animation. So I'm going to show you how I take verbatim text and start to think about how a short film could work. So there's this amazing file that I found in the National Archives on the use of psychology and propaganda. And it includes this memorandum on the functions of the Ministry of Information by a psychologist called Edward Glover. And basically in this memorandum he makes the case for why the Ministry of Information during the Second World War should have much more authority and be only second to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet in terms of influence in government. And he kind of makes the argument that kind of the maintenance of public morale was one of the key elements of the war effort and its success, and he kind of makes the case for that in a variety of different ways. I came across this particular passage in it, which I just is such a fascinating passage. I'm going to read it out, and I'm going to show you how I kind of would use it as the kind of material for a kind of short film script. So in this passage he writes, this psychologist writes, "Why give news at all? Primarily to satisfy the need for accurate information about the war. If no news were given, the people would in the long run rebel against the government, but all the time they would manufacture their own news, which would naturally take the form of unfounded rumours and suspicions. Admittedly, all peoples at all times, particularly in bad times, manufacture their own news, which is heavily impregnated with fear and hope. Nevertheless, the amount of rumour existing in the country at any given time is to some extent a measure of the efficiency of the Ministry of Information or government communications." So this is a fantastic paragraph. It resonates right now in Britain, and I kind of it's kind of text like this. I'm kind of really interested in like taking material that I find and placing it or colliding it with other material to kind of to generate a new reading of it. So with this text, I would be particularly interested in using it to connect it to contemporary Britain and what's going on. So I'm going to show you a bit about how I do that. So I kind of usually my starting point is to make a series of voiceovers for a film, which would be narrated by a voiceover artist, and I'd connect these kind of like kind of sentences to some images or an animated sequence. So this is the first sentence. "Why give news at all? If no news were given, the people would in the long run rebel against the government, but all the time they would manufacture their own news, which would naturally take the form of unfounded rumours and suspicions." So I've got this scene that I'm currently working on for a film, Where is the Blitz?, where there's a camera panning through a kind of quite broken landscape where there are kind of completely depleted supermarket shelves and supermarket trolleys that are stacked high with toilet paper, and there's this Sun newspaper headline at the top talking about stockpiling mums showing off their massive toilet paper hauls after hoarding throughout coronavirus, and the camera pans through this landscape. And if it would be interesting, I think if this was overlaid with this text, or if this text came before it, there'd be an interesting connection between the manufacturing of news that this text talk about, and the kind of manufacturing of news and the spread of rumor that caused lots of bulk buying during the coronavirus pandemic. So I think, like, kind of, yeah, connecting this past sentence with this present day, or like this landscape that speaks to present day Britain would generate quite an interesting effect. And this could then lead to the next, the next sentence, which is, admittedly, all peoples at all times, particularly in bad times, manufacture their own news, which is heavily impregnated with fear and hope. And this could lead to a camera panning to this scene, where the camera pans through this kind of broken landscape again, and it lands on this projection screen on which there is a newspaper comment being displayed, which says, "I agree, the British people are not what they were. We were a lot more resilient during the war years." Well, I don't kind of, so by comparing or kind of leading this animation with a voiceover that is talking about the manufacturing of news that is impregnated with fear and hope, there's a kind of I guess there's like a contrast that's generated, and there's a kind of critical reading of this particular sentence that's generated by being preceded by a voiceover saying this text. So I'm kind of interested in this, creating these kind of collisions and these kind of critical collisions. And I'll just do a last one, which is, nevertheless, the amount of rumour existing in the country at any given time is to some extent a measure of the efficiency of government communications. And it'd be interesting to lead this particular sentence with a camera panning through the landscape to land on this newspaper billboard on which an ex-SAS soldier claims that a no-deal Brexit would be a blessing, as the hardship and suffering would bring back British values. So I'm interested in kind of, yeah, this is a kind of way of thinking, or like kind of, I guess, like kind of engaging with verbatim text. I kind of cut it up and I throw it against animated scenes, or kind of animated scenes where there's kind of more contemporary British news content, to kind of just, yeah, think through the interesting kind of effects that are generated. But I think there's a really interesting like film in this material that would come from using this text that I found. So hopefully that's given you some sense of how I use, kind of archival content to make images and short films. Yeah, thanks very much for your time and for listening to my talk.
Thanks ever so much, Max. Now we do have time allotted for a Q&A. At the moment, I think you're all just very engaged in the chat, and we haven't actually got many specific questions, but I do have one at the moment for Rashi. Somebody is asking Rashi how this experience might influence your practice, and are you working on a body of work around the black hole?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I am actually. So yeah, for the last 2 years, after I graduated from Camberwell, I received this like alumni grant to help. I studied photography in the fine art department. There's a great grant that helps you to produce an artist publication, and you have mentoring, and they help you kind of with the whole process. So I'm making a book that's looking at the first image of a black hole and really trying to unfold that image and squeeze it and see, what goes into it. How do we engage? What do we bring with us when we engage with that image? What grows out of it? And part of that is looking at, I don't think I'd be looking at kind of media and PR so much, but I am looking at these existing systems of science communication, like how these images are taken from astronomical and astrophysical research and then kind of get pushed through this channel of a media PR and then end up in a news article online, and then end up turning into a meme, and then this compounding feedback loop of science fiction. And just particularly a lot of astronomy and astrophysical science images, we talk about them as being photographs in a very social and cultural sense. We refer to them as photographs, but that if you really look into it, they're very far from that. Like, a lot of them are artificial images, they're data visualizations, which technically all images are, but a lot of these images, like the black hole image, that orange and yellow that you see in the photo, it's artificial. It's a radio astronomy image, which is only made from 10 very small data points, and the rest of the image is produced by an algorithm. All these different things, to me, when I found them out, I couldn't really focus on anything else. It's become a really wide, sprawling project, and the publication's hopefully coming out next year, and has a lot of contributions by other artists, because I wanted it to have, to be rich and have multiple voices. So then at the beginning of lockdown, I had a lot of extra time. So I ended up doing a real deep dive into this black hole of Calcutta story. But again, like I was saying, everything was remote. I was doing everything online from home. And I'd certainly got a lot out of it. I think the internet is a really amazing resource, and one that interestingly comes with its own kind of cataloguing and archival system. But going to the National Archives really gave me again, it's that complexity I was talking about. Like, I feel like I have more like solid research, which I think is true, but I think that is really interesting that we think of it like that. But yeah, it's added so much for me for my kind of larger practice.
That's great. Thanks very much. Okay, so now we're going to take our slightly delayed break. I think if we still aim to come back at the same time as was originally planned, which is 11:40. So we're going to have just over 10 minutes break, and then we'll be coming back for the next two presentations. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you soon. Okay. I hope everyone's managed to do what they needed to do. I managed to get a cup of tea, and that's the important thing for me. So we're ready now to move on to our next presentation. This is from Julia Ingle, and I will first of all just introduce her. So Julia is a UK-based artist whose work looks at how personality develops its methods of interacting with itself and the outer social and physical world. Julia is interested in the relationships people have with the space around them and how this applies to the psychological landscapes that we all possess. Julia's working methods have consisted of drawing using any tool from a pencil and pen video recorder, performative acts of walking, photographic selections, collage, textiles, and thread. And Julia's presentation has been recorded, and I think my colleague Charlie is going to set that playing for us.
My name is Julia Ingle. I'm one of the artists engaging with the National Archive. My work revolves around an interest in psychological and somatic space, and I have an experimental approach to my practice. I will share some thoughts and some of the images I came across. But please be aware that after I mention UFOs and the map of Darnley's murder, I shared two pieces of material, but although are not explicit, are associated with serious crime. The image library was my main source of contact, and a vast range of images sparked my interest. Initially, I started to list them, but within the first 30 minutes, I was aware of how large this list could be. I searched through the image library's named sections, noting places, occasions, deterioration of paper or signifiers in a map. I used a sketchbook, took reference photographs, and the occasional screenshot. I started conversations. As every item exists as a separate image, the viewer can skip through time, continent, and history within a flash of a few seconds. I picked out dates I knew or names of places that struck my mind with clarity. I know this, I've heard this before. This is where artist and archive meet. The images shown fit into my history. The first is the River Thames in 1746, where my 6 times great-grandparents lived. Then a sketch of roadways to Arnhem that mentions some areas where my dad and his tank fought in World War II. The straw unicorn and lion were exhibits at the Festival of Britain that my family attended. Continually searching with image in mind, I came across a book showing Chertsey Abbey. I love the combination of handwriting, image, and illustrative method, layering up intent of information brought together to exist in one place. When an item is preserved and kept for future generations, the nature and purpose of the information exist together forever. It is interesting to consider what the edges of that premise are. Sometimes, as in the mapped image of a site of bomb damage in Berlin, it is obvious. This combination of information exists only to pinpoint a specific occurrence or event. These 16th and 17th century maps and sketches are so beautiful and tender to look at that I was totally absorbed. Their decorative quality is perfection, but equally shows how physical forms have been developed into pictorial forms. This sketch of Harden has houses, moors, and rivers. The darkness of colour intrigued me, seemingly representing the colours in real life, the colour of moorland. It appears to be a mix of map and painting. I find a level of comfort in these images, both in how they allow me to feel and also their visual nature. Maps can encapsulate many objectives at the same time. Geographical features can be laid down with historical ideas or politics, showing a fleet of ships or the size of a place in relation to another. Certain colours may be representative of geographical features or occurrences. They may speak to a more encompassing language than we have now than, say, with Ordnance Survey maps. Some images, such as here in Breydon Forest, there is an earthy feel, a sense of a body or visceral. This thematic nature of image appeals. This thematic nature relates to our body's experience. It sees how the body reacts to the sight, sound, feel of an object. Looking at so many maps and documents, I found the urge to have physical materials in my hand, to make up for the lack of being able to use my sense of touch. I drew notations of ink blots and galaxies on paper. I noticed the structure of documents and saw that a document was stitched. The remit asked the artist to relate to an archive, and as I have an experimental approach, I wanted to develop new forms of reacting and to move from one thing to another without preempting. I cut out shapes of moth holes from felt and realized the shape was similar to that of an ink blot. Previously, I had noted the space in my hand as important, but the ink blots need to take the shape of my hand like a liquid. I started to cut out and fold flat pieces of cardboard as I looked at shapes of hills and fields and mountains. I added tape in different colours, and I started to move them around, changing their shape. I love the performative elements in this type of process, the physical movements of my hand and arms. I wanted to experiment with the shapes as they seemed to be turning into hill-like structures. I then used a thick type of leather as it's more liquid than card. Needing some way to fix the edges together, I chose staples. A quote from my research log says, "When I put the stapled landform in my hand, it turned into a small hill. It was a beautiful form to have appearing from my hand, and indeed it could make a beautiful drawing. I had a vision of holding the hill in my hand and walking up the mother of the leather hill. So it is like a three-dimensional map, I guess. The landform, including the performative action of a walk. It is a feeling that these landforms having a presence and to be with this presence thematically. I want them to be in my space." A mentor of mine, Monica Ross, discussed with me where the work is. Artistically, I want to hold and touch something, but here the process involves digital images. I want to interact with materials in relation to the digital image, but time is short, so maybe it isn't appropriate or possible. As well as working with materials, it became important to keep my thought process. I used a research log, notebook, conversations, and a voice recorder. I realized that this wasn't a linear process. It's a bit like drawing in a sketchbook. Until you get your hands in there with the materials, you aren't really sure what will happen. I started to use whatever medium seemed the most appropriate at the time. I started to see where the work is. I discussed the role of the research log with Ellie Porter from Art360. On a macro scale, the archive looks at how items sit together, but this equally happens on a micro scale. If information is placed in a series, document, or individual item, they form a type of collection, a collective image. The image library has countless examples. The information is brought together to form a new terrain, create a new situation, or an explanation for an occurrence. This culmination is interesting in terms of what form it takes, what it includes, and what it dismisses. Sometimes the collective item needs to be presented with formality because of the emotive information shown. Here the bomb damage in Norwich needs to be recorded and seen within one glance of an eye for practical purposes, but the emotion behind the image, with all the families affected, is not made apparent as it falls aside the premise of the document. Sometimes what is required is simple. Barbara Hepworth's piece for the 1950s Venice Biennale shows description, image, title, owner's name, and insurance value. As we go through life, We soak in and disregard information constantly. Our minds continually create our own mental and physical documentation. Initial points of interest either grow or are dismissed. We can draw this content in through decades or over a few minutes. From previous delves into discovery, I developed an interest in how such whole documents can be formed. In the ship's surgeon's books and the Pitt River sketches, I found a visual counterpart. I like the layering of intention, information, and how this forms into a whole world. I revisited and looked at documents of UFO sightings to see what types of information these would contain, how they formulated into an idea, and to look at a supposition but wouldn't exist otherwise. As artists, we constantly map out our new worlds. As a family historian, I'm always in the process of making documents and collections. Equally, as this project developed, I came across individual pieces that I wished I could place together. I developed an unexpected liking for information regarding Mary Queen of Scots. It kept appearing under single word searches such as Darnley, watches, and sketches. I had an unfulfilled compulsion to place these items together, like a family. Collective information can take many forms. The following sketch map relates to the murder of Mary's second husband Darnley at Kirkfield. It has the feel of a news report or a collection of information framing Darnley's death within particular terms. It is a mapping of an act, place, people and emotion in one image. Darnley lies dead, a child sits in the cot. There are townspeople and buildings. A body is being carried and a grave is dug. It is creating an explanation from a certain point of view. It is creating a political move. The next two slides concern images relating to serious crime. During the project, I used a device of inputting different search terms, but an unwelcome and unexpected turn was about to happen. I couldn't remember Darnley's name, so I typed in murder. I didn't consider what I would see. As a result, a whole series of disparate images appeared. Cupboards, diagrams, insides of houses, the unexpected photo album page featuring Hindley's dog. They are very stark images. In my research log, I noted, I'm not quite sure my mind wants to go there. But this did stay in my mind. It was a couple of weeks into the project. I was using my voice recorder to track thoughts, having conversations and writing my research log. I kept mentioning this photograph, saying, there's these two armchairs and an edge of a sofa. It became a bit of a mantra, as I couldn't understand what I'd seen. It raised a lot of unexpected questions, and I mentioned this to Ellie. The image that stayed with Julia has a disturbing atmosphere. We discuss why this may be. It could be the absence of people in the image, that something bad has happened there, a sense of something missing. We talk about the difficulty of finding the right language to describe such scenes and their human effects. This is from my research log. I knew the images were associated with murder, but I think with some of the images, if you saw them in a different circumstance, it may appear to be an average image, such as with the armchairs, but you can tell something is not usual. It is with the angle of the photograph or the height that it is taken from. Unless you know it is a forensic image, it is difficult to recognize how to read the photograph. I decided to think about this through the following considerations. What images and content did I want to see and think about? I do consider situations that are reactive within my psyche or my body sensation. I do work somatically. This is a governmental archive and it does contain many unpleasant documents. I didn't want to hide away from any images or content that provoked a difficult emotional response. I needed to find ways to work with such images and support myself. Here is a startling and forceful image of bombing during the Second World War. Again, it provoked the mix of a somatic, sensory, of emotion, intellect and reasoning. I had to hold a space where I wasn't quite sure what was happening. I had to be within this space of not knowing, whilst being accompanied by the disquieting feelings. I noticed certain images or feelings returning. This involved a process I called lapping. An image came to my mind and then went away, then returned. It may or may not gradually develop into a form. With each reoccurrence, something new had happened in between. It's like water at the edge of a beach. Something is slightly changed by the repetition, but you can't quite see what it is. My research log became very useful, but I also found myself having to take decisions. It occurred to me I was creating my own research log as an archive. These are some of the questions I found I was asking. What is seen as important and gets a voice? What is not recognized and remains unseen? What is something is not pre-understood? Whose language is accepted? What happens to information without category? Who gets to frame things? I had a sense I was finding a space. The studio space is a large thinking and doing space. Mine were extensions of mind and sketchbook. The space in a studio where you sit on your own with walls some meters away provides a spatial quality for mind and body. It's the same type of feeling when travelling on a train. It is that which is ahead and behind and to the side of you. Being in a space that continually can turn into anything. This research log is turning into a similar thing. It is somewhere to return to and find a home. The following show how intrinsic the form of a diagram is to the information. In the Oath of Allegiance signed by the Walloons, you can see everyone's names are written around so as not to provide an unintended hierarchy. Here is a prescribed airspace of London airports and the locations of tanks and ammunition dumps in Brighton in the Second World War. Talking to the National Archive and Art360 became very important, and I asked for copies of our conversations. This was at the end of the engagement. I will share, though, how I reacted with information exchanged during our discussions. At the beginning of one conversation with pen in hand, I carried the discussion we had onto paper, as shown here. I wondered, as somatic language is difficult to locate in a digital format, how I could embed such experiences into my practice. In the physical world, you can manipulate, throw, reform, cut up. You can do more than if it's solely in digital form. So thank you for your time. I'll finish with this quote from Ellie as it relates to the context of artist engagement with the National Archive. In engaging with the National Archive, Julia has been creating handheld objects which she describes as hills. We discuss the value of honouring these objects in their own right as part of the artist's archive, and the importance of creating visibility for artist processes rather than focusing on output alone. This project will hopefully generate a wider understanding of what artists' work involves. I think Julia's research log is also a great example of this.
That was great. Thank you so much, Julia. I hope you all enjoyed that. We have our final presentation and then a chance for some more Q&A. So our final presentation is from Nina. Hi, Nina. And Nina is a reader in fine art at Goldsmiths, University in London. She makes work that begins with the unfinished business of past social movements and the challenges of revisiting the energies that these movements created. Nina is interested in how identification and disidentification occur, empathy and inhabitation, and the risks of staying loyal or respectful to the kinds of materials that initiate her work. Nina is co-editor of Inventive Methods, The Happening of the Social, published by Routledge in 2012, and that's a collection which explores how research might better work with openness and ambiguity. And Art on the Underground book walks, and We Will Replace All Men with Machines for the Barbican Public Spaces. Both of those were in 2019. And Nina has an upcoming commission for Stevenage Borough Council. So Nina, your turn, over to you.
Thanks very much. And that was just a lovely segue from Julia, actually, because I'm going to carry on thinking about being moved in different ways. So I'm going to share my screen now. So I'm going to talk to the title of Moving Unruly Objects, which is kind of a way of talking about my encounter with the National Archives. So in this presentation, I'll talk about my encounter with the National Archives, or as the employees call it, TNA, in terms of the unruly objects which do or might circulate through its infrastructures. And I asked one of the employees recently to tell me how many of on-site visitors are relating to family history, and it's 29%, and I'll explain why that's been important to me in a little while. I have worked for a long time looking at LGBT plus histories, and as Sarah just said, I completed a project a couple of years ago for Art on the Underground, called Our Pink Depot, which looked at histories in relation to transport systems, past and future. But in terms of archival work, I've often been a bit ambivalent about how I should approach archives. And in fact, I've more usually used materials in my work that come from what I often say is people's sock drawers or behind the sofa or on their bookshelves, rather than things that have been squeezed through the classificatory systems of official archives. So I came quite explicitly to the National Archives, and I'm very thankful to them and Art360 to let me do this. So I came with a slight ambivalence of what I was going to do and how I was going to do it, given what I often experienced in classification systems of them being systems that excluded or obscured or were relations of ruling. So LGBT plus people have often been treated themselves as unruly objects, and I saw that immediately when I started understanding the structure of TNA. So, for example, appearing in records from police files in terms of criminal convictions, or moral panics about obscene publications. The most obvious one that I looked at was to do with the Well of Loneliness. When I think about moving, in my title of Moving Unruly Objects, I consider both being emotionally moved by records and literal displacement or mobility, and that really, I think, provides a really nice link to Julia's presentation. So as an artist, I'm interested in what kinds of materials and methodologies at TNA might be brought into relation with contemporary artistic practices to ask new questions, provoke new thoughts, and address new audiences. And it was nice reading the chat as people introduced themselves to realise there are so many artists in the audience, some of them PhD students, doing work with archives, and it'd be great to have an extended conversation. It's really wonderful that TNA have hosted this, because I think contemporary art has now got a real engagement with archives in lots of ways, whether it's artists such as Elizabeth Price, people who've really influenced me, or, as I think I saw in the chat, in relation to newly undiscovered gaps in archives like trans work and also textile work. I set myself a couple of principles in engaging with TNA. I told myself not to be limited by searching and retrieving content. I told myself to stay with the materials. I, as Rashi said at the beginning, was really touched by the ability to touch. And also, in relation to my previous work, where I've sung in different institutions using an untrained singing voice, I told myself, you might want to sing. So I started off by going to the archives and asking myself the questions that one would ask if one was being commissioned to do a site-specific artwork, which of course I hadn't been, but that was the way I approached the site. So I thought, what is this site? How can I address it using live performance? How can I invent or generate the problems using the space and atmosphere that is in and around the building? Now, I often work as an artist in long-term projects, but also with lots of kind of short-term iterations of ideas and flights of fancy. So I really appreciated, again, Julia's idea of shifting through different kinds of material forms, but also using the self as an index, a kind of touch point, an emotional touch point to what was going on. So as I met the first TNA employees, I started investigating and trying to understand what the very building did, what it held, what practices it held for staff and on-site visitors. So I found, as soon as I went to deposit my bag, that the TNA actually wasn't only an official system, but also was a space of improvisation. So here in the locker room, I expect many of you may have not been to the site in Richmond, but it's a space of improvisation where people put books to swap and maybe to barter. And I thought about that as a social practice, which was so evident to me as a first-time visitor, laid out for a kind of social world, a social world of exchange, which I hadn't at all expected. But I also was trying to track what kind of objects, records as objects, the materialities were present in the building itself, how they moved. So on the left here, you will see the lockers where you can reserve and where you retrieve your documents. And these were just an amazing, on the day I was there, they were lit by the sunlight to show this most amazing edges of the perspex that make them. And that was very visually striking to me, but also this idea that you get your little box, your document in a box. And I also looked at the other objects that provide the infrastructure for readers to look at what are sometimes very delicate records. And in fact, again, if you haven't been to the archive and registered, you won't know that one of the things you have to do is watch a video to show you how to handle objects. And this involves quite interesting gestures of folding and unfolding, protecting materials such as paper, rolling and unrolling. So immediately, again, being interested in live performance and evocation, I was curious about how gesture might come into these kinds of worlds. I was also interested in how objects move through the building, and the TNA has two sides, one which is conservation and has a lot of the offices, and the other which is where the public can access in terms of the rooms. And I noticed that the structure of the building allowed for this kind of amazing performative moment of walking with the records by an employee between one side to the other. And at the same time as I was reflecting on this, I was also visiting and investigating some of the textiles that were available in the department trade pattern books. And I suddenly came across this kind of potential juxtaposition, I suppose, of a kind of temporal drag, maybe, that could suit the people moving the records. So I kept thinking, how do objects move through the building? How and when does this work occur? And could it be transformed? I also looked extensively around the building because it is on a plot which contains not only interior spaces but exterior spaces. So I kept thinking about this fountain, which is the first way that you encounter if you walk from the station of Kew Gardens. You encounter this fountain and then you kind of walk around it to reach the main entrance. So I kept thinking, what could move here? And how could records or the work of TNA be present here? And then, because my interest is in LGBT histories and worlds, how might LGBT methodologies help here? As I said, I often work in long projects, but also I do work with this kind of intuitive flights of fancy idea. And very quickly I imagined, almost probably within the first hour that I was there, an LGBT methodology which might work to animate this space. And that is maybe some archivists synchronized swimming, and I thought maybe the methodology here would be the synchronized swimming at the International Gay Games. This is Paris, I think 2015 or 2018, and I explored straight away and inquired, and my inquiry was put through the Estates Department, whether one could swim in this water. I thought this might be an alternative way of evoking the movement around the site, but also a way which kind of an imagination of records might be able to be moved. Unfortunately, the answer from Estates is no, it's not possible to swim in this water. So I decided to take another tack, still using this space. And that is, I started looking at things that were present that were in relation to swimming. So I found this buoyancy aid. This is in the photos section if people want to look it up. And I thought this is just a really amazing object and proposition, because it looks like a butterfly, and you'll see it seems to be wrapped around the swimmers, but it seemed to me an object that could be highly performative and could be remade in a certain way, maybe floated by itself on the fountains outside, perhaps to be another way of encountering different objects and the way they might move around the archive. And perhaps with some design features, it could be explicitly queered or made camp or relate to a drag performance. I didn't ignore the records completely. In terms of my own history, I was very involved in protests against Section 28, and so I was interested in looking at the records of the Prime Minister's office. I spent quite a long time reading through the Prime Minister's office file on homosexual rights in Great Britain, Part 1. Part 2 is lodged at the archive, but it's not going to be open till 2051, I think. So I could only look at documents in there from 84 to 94. And again, I talked about movement and emotions, and I was interested to find this little note to do with homosexual rights. This says, to do with an early meeting with Sir Ian McKellen from Stonewall. Prime Minister, I attached the note to Chris Patten, which you requested following your meeting with Sir Ian McKellen. I attached to the note of the meeting to send to Mr. Patten. You'll see it does not record your personal views in case of embarrassing leaks, but I'm making them known orally to Mr. Baker's private secretary. So in terms of kind of being moved and thinking about emotions and how those affected me, I did find that reading through something that I'd protested at, in terms of all these tiny little bits of the record in this folder, this was the digital version, were actually incredibly moving to thinking what was going on in the Prime Minister's office as I was making banners and protesting against a law that banned any promotion of homosexuality by public organisations except in relation to disease. I want to take you on a different journey now, which was my other investigation in relation to the Conservation Department. So I was really interested in the materialities of the objects that travelled, and I went into the Conservation Department with a series of questions which led to a different kind of investigation. So I was wondering about unruly objects in terms of their movement, and then you get to this very kind of literal idea of how do you make boxes for storage and transport? What happens to objects like this that have an unruliness in their physical manifestation and yet need to be stored and maybe pulled out for conservation or for consultation? So this book or this volume is from the Board of Trade, the Patent Office. You can find it under the BT classification. And I was interested in how one of the conservators had made a wrapping with handles to constructed it to wrap this unruly object, and that was how it was going to be moved around. The box that it contained was absolutely falling apart and it was huge. So I was interested here in the work needed to allow objects to move, how and when this should be visible. Here is the actual wrapping that had been constructed, and I have to thank Alison Archibald who made this and also described how it was made in terms of bookbinding materials. So the care of each object potentially, given the number of objects in the TNA, is absolutely meticulous and very moving in itself. I also started thinking about unruliness in terms of instability and unstable artefacts that are in the conservation department at the moment. So this daguerreotype, which is of a napkin pattern, is in need of conservation work, and that was a fantastic thing to think about in terms of how conservation has to start and the risks involved in the materiality of these objects. I also said when I emailed the Conservation Department, I'm interested in fading colours. I was thinking a lot about posters. I think Sarah said at the beginning the propaganda posters, which came up again in other people's presentations. I was really interested in thinking about how conservation dealt with fading colour. And I had a long conversation with Luthia about the different kind of ways that the Conservation Department tests and tries to assess the potential damage to artefacts in relation to light. And we talked specifically about colours that could come back and wouldn't fade or could be unfaded, and things that lasted a long time. So again, I was interested in time and the materiality. So Luthia told me that Prussian blue is recoverable, i.e. it can fade, but potentially it might be able to come back under a different kind of light, and that ochres last longer. She said to me, think of cave painting. The last thing I want to talk about is the way in which I ended up having a proposal about moving between a conservation methodology and something which recognised LGBT worlds in relation to TNA. So I started thinking about developing an unruly object methodology from conservation and a way to translate from 2D to 3D. So Luthia within the Conservation Department is a chemist who examines pigments through examining the crystal structure, as I said, to see if it might fade. Potentially, this methodology, if I looked at the crystal structure of documents, provided a way to get from a record through, say, an ink or a paint to a 3D object. So you can imagine one of those propaganda posters being analysed, and each crystal that was discovered in, say, the paint or the pigment could be translated back into its 3D form and remade as part of a sculpture. So I talked to Luthia a lot about this, and she told me about this kind of Bible called the Pigment Compendium, which has these pages and pages of the crystal structures in relation to the pigments. And she said, yes, theoretically it's possible to take that pigment to translate it into a crystal which has a known crystal structure, and then to translate that into 3D. But, and this is where I'm at really now, I started then thinking, how and why would one choose records in order to do this? There are some things that are very colourful, but not necessarily all the things that I'd found in relation to LGBT history. So I ended up proposing, and this is very speculative, that something that was quite well known to TNA, which is the will of Anne Lister, who is known, whose dates are 1791 to 1840, and was known as the first modern lesbian. Her will might be assessed by the Conservation Department in terms of its ink or pigments, and then translated into some kind of crystal form, which perhaps could be performed at, or sung to, or in fact integrated in some way to the fabric, even imaginally, of the TNA outside. So here is, you know, potentially a very heuristic model of the will of Anne Lister, which is could maybe create new engagements with TNA and also its infrastructures. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nina. I have got a couple of questions. The first one is for Max, and then I think the last one could be for any or all of you. So Max, the question for you is, do you use oral history and interviews in your work, especially for events which are still in living memory and lived experience for some individuals?
Yes, yeah, I do. I kind of, yeah. So in the kind of previous film, like I made a film about kind of London black cab drivers, and I was kind of interested in how they So I interviewed a couple of black cab taxi drivers and used their voices, what they kind of said to me as the kind of base for the script of the animated film that I made called London Knowledge. But then I'm more working more with kind of written text where I where I haven't actually interacted with the people who've written it, and I feel like I have like more latitude to kind of play around that verbatim text. An example of this, instruction lines, where which is about a Knightsbridge billionaire, the script for the film was basically made from complaints to the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea Council on their kind of planning application website. So I kind of work with different kinds of oral history, yes, in that way.
Thanks very much, Max.
Also, I just want to say thank you. That was just a really fascinating kind of insight into just a totally different research process to the one that I went on when I was in the archives, and yeah, really got a lot out of it.
Great, thank you. I realise we are already 1 minute over time, and we do want to just give some closing remarks, but I have one question that if you could just give perhaps a really short answer, whoever wants to pick it, whoever gets in first. The question is, are there particular barriers to working creatively with archives, and how could archive institutions become more conducive to creative practice? And that's something we would really love to know here too. So who wants to pick that to answer?
I don't mind quickly saying something. Does my microphone work?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Well, for me, I'm still kind of starting out with my relationship to archives, but up until now, this was the first experience where I could actually take photos of the documents that I was working with. Other archives before, it wasn't allowed. So being a creative person, being an artist, that makes a huge impact, even if you're not allowed to, because of copyright, if you're not allowed to use those images, just the fact that you have something visual that you can take home and engage with. And for me, that had a really big impact. So that's something that the National Archives already does. So that's a big positive. But yeah, that would be my big takeaway.
That's great, thank you. Okay, I'm now just going to hand over to two colleagues who've been working on this project, Catherine and Ellie, for some closing remarks.
Hi everyone, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the artists who participated in this project, and just really wow at your presentations and your engagement, because it really was so insightful and fascinating to hear how you all individually engaged with different materials and different aspects of the National Archives. And I think me and Catherine now just wanted to sort of feed back some of our thoughts and reflections on what you discussed. I mean, I have pages and pages of notes, I have to say. But I think one of the key things that came out from all of your presentations actually is the importance of what I think Rashi mentioned about the footprints, and engaging with the peripheries, and also what Nina, you were talking about, these unruly elements of archival spaces and archival materials. And I guess as well, Rashi, from your presentation, it really kind of struck me that what you found essentially was the kind of expanded realm in which the Black Hole of Calcutta existed. So there are all these kind of fragments of the story disseminated so widely. And that was really evident in your presentation. And then, Max, really as well, I think, in relation to Julia's presentation, actually, thinking about the somatic engagement with the archive, and how, I guess, Julia, you've kind of mediated the flatness potentially of the digital space by actually handling material and creating, I guess, what we described as hills, and thinking about like bodily and psychic understanding of materials. But also, I guess, Max, your work and the way you use archives and transform text into this kind of virtual space, and the way you're kind of splicing up archival images and placing them in a virtual world also kind of does reconfigure the digital realm as something that really can actually be quite, I guess, move beyond the flatness of a digital screen. So I thought that was really, really fascinating and interesting. And, just as well, Julia, within your presentation, I think just really, to me, it struck me that, you start at sort of one point of engagement, and then through this kind of instinctive interest and also kind of spatial understanding and visual language that you are so attuned to, you were led down so many different pathways. And, I think the complexity of trying to describe and engage with images that have unpleasant connotations is something that is incredibly complicated for, large governmental archives. That's something that I think, you described really well. And I think Nina as well, your engagement with material in the archive that, provoked and I guess kind of had affiliations to particular memories and experiences that you had, is something that's really important. It's an important dimension of archives that I think can't be underestimated. But yes, I mean, there's so much more to say, to be honest, but I also want to hand over to Catherine as well to share some of her thoughts and also talk about the workshop tomorrow.
Great, thanks, Ellie. Yeah, I have the same issue with my pages and pages of notes. So I just want to summarize a few things that I've thought and kind of organize these into concepts. But the main thing I wanted to say first is actually, how exciting this was to listen to all these presentations. It's been so interesting talking to all the artists about their approach. We've learned so much. I mean, I think from the National Archives perspective, we often don't hear very much about how people use our material in some ways. It's kind of people come in and they look at things and then they leave, and we don't always find out how it works. So it's really interesting to get a more detailed insight into that, into the journey. And I think that's something that came up in the presentations as well, is, it's the process, not the output, that's really important here. And that's part of what we should be kind of exploring and celebrating. And when we first spoke to artists on this project, immediately questions were asked to us that we just never considered before as National Archives, that are just concepts and ideas that we just have not thought about. So in that, even the initial meetings were so interesting. We've learned so much from it. But yeah, so I just want to highlight a few ideas that I think we can discuss in more detail at the event tomorrow as well. The first is around this idea of images rising to the top, as it were, rising to the top of collective memory, to our kind of consciousness. And I think this came through in a couple of presentations. I think through Rashi's talking about the picture postcard, and how an image can become a symbol of a place due to kind of a lack of archival material, so pushing people to work on the periphery and find images. And I think that does link with Max's approach as well, in terms of the impact of particular images on collective memory. And I've always found that area really interesting. So that's one point. And again, I mean, I know Ellie mentioned this, but the using artistic approaches to the material that may not have been considered before. So cutting up images and sort of revealing new insights about them, forcing us to look at details of images that we may not have considered before, restaging them. That's just a fascinating area. And I think it links in as well with this idea of the experimental approach that Julie talked about, which I think some of the other artists kind of use as well in different ways. So concentrating on the visual, and even if you are limited to using the digital world, the digital platform to actually access images, you can still explore that in a physical way, and that's done through experimentation. So that was a really interesting area. Emotion is obviously one that's come up several times in most of the presentations. So And we've heard about all kinds of emotions, haven't we? We've talked about comfort in certain in the visual material people are encountering, comfort in colour, but also the kind of disturbing aspects that Julia talked about as well. And I think there's something interesting there about, you know, the National Archives material sometimes being very practical in its purpose, and therefore sidelining the emotion that's behind it, the kind of emotional stories of individuals behind it. But then emotion can be brought back in through the encounters we have with the material. And this also links in with that idea of, you know, the emotion that we feel when we physically encounter records, that, you know, we're in the space, like Rashi was saying about, you know, we're in the space where the original writer was, and that's, you know, can be an emotional experiences. And then finally, about spaces and materiality, both physical spaces and like spaces we create in the mind to kind of explore these things. And then materiality of not just the documents, but of the building and the atmosphere of the building and those kinds of things that we, again, it's just areas that we just hadn't considered when we think about the National Archives. So many things to talk about, and which brings me on to tomorrow, basically, because the whole idea of our third event of the series is to give us a space to actually talk about all these things that have come up in this session and in yesterday's session. So so tomorrow we're going to be having a session which is focusing particularly on having breakout rooms where we can discuss these ideas that have come up. So I hope that many of you are signed up to that. If you have signed up but you're no longer able to make it, please let us know, because it may be that we can open up the spaces to other people. And equally, if you're not signed up and you would like to be, please also let us know, and we can try and fit you in if we've got room. But the key thing to mention is that these are going to be highly interactive breakout sessions. So we want everyone to come, you know, with a really ready to engage and discuss. Ellie and I are going to be dropping in and out of the breakout rooms over the course of the session and kind of listening into some of the conversations, and then we can have a discussion at the end. So that's basically how the day's going to work. And we're going to be focusing on two key questions, which we will send around before the session as well, but we'll just mention them now. So the first one is, what is the value of artists' intervention in the archive? And you'll see that both of these questions are quite broad, and we want them to be considered in a broad way. So we want you to, because obviously people at this event will be from different areas. Some will be artists, some will be archivists, some will be, you know, other professional backgrounds. So from whatever your perspective is, consider what that value might be of artist intervention in the archive. Ellie, did you want to expand on any of that question at all?
So the two questions that we've proposed, what is the value of artist intervention in the archive, and what insights can engagement with different types of archives provoke? They're obviously both quite broad, but the first question is really focused around the structures of archives, and the second question is focused around your engagement with individual or items or materials in the archive. So hopefully they both allow everybody involved in the workshop to sort of engage with archives on kind of two slightly different levels. And maybe we can also like discuss how those two different levels intersect. So that's the idea behind the questions, but yes, hopefully they are broad enough for everyone to be able to contribute from all your different perspectives and professional backgrounds. So yeah.
Yep. So yeah, we'll send around those questions, so you'll have them written down beforehand. So do have a think about it before you come, and we can really get into those discussions. So yeah, the final thing I was going to just mention was about that we will be sending around a survey for to get your feedback. Obviously, this event series is kind of new to National Archives, and it's a new collaboration between Art360 and National Archives. So we're really interested to know what you think of how it's gone, and also, you know, where you might see other events in the future that we could run. So that'll be sent around after tomorrow's event. So do really hope you take the time to fill that in. Ellie, is that everything we need to mention for tomorrow?
I think so.
Can
yes.
I just
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah,
can I just say there's one question has come through asking who should they contact if they want to attend tomorrow? So would that be Charlie?
Research, yeah, so if you contact research@nationalarchives.gov.uk, we can probably put that in the chat as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that tomorrow in the workshop, we will also be talking about the presentations today and some of the points that maybe we didn't have time to share with you here, because I can see on my list of points, there is so much more that I would really love to discuss. And I also just wanted to thank all of the artists who've been involved in this, for their really enthusiastic and engaged commitment to this project, and all the innovative ways that they've approached the archive. I mean, I've learned so much from all of your presentations, and I'm truly inspired by your different approaches. And that will definitely manifest in the way we work with artists through Art360. So thank you very, very much for all of your work.
And thank you very much as well from National Archives. It's been brilliant. So so we'll hope to see many of you tomorrow at the session. But thanks again to everyone for taking part today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.